hit it almost every time and then I miss one. How we gon' get ourselves up out of this one? Hard to get up from this like Sonny Liston. Feel like it's and Lambert with the Pistons. Bad boys but no Will Smithin'. Only real fiction. Got to the fork of the road, a split decision.
We are back. I'm sorry for my technical difficulties. My mic is sounding bugged. Bob Power, you there? But anyway, shout out to Tribe Called Quest. But so as we were kind of tapping into and was mentioned, we were talking about something I find hard to believe, and that is a sexual recession. Then what I find even harder to believe is who we're finding a sexual recession with. And I'm going to give y'all a hint. It's not married men. But anyway, boom, y'all supposed to give me a drum on that. But let me swing back into Brother JC Polk, because I know you were kind of tapping into that. So we're going to kind of lead into that. But let's talk about the sexual recession with our younger generation. You up, Brother JC?
Well, it really came out of an article that was in The Atlantic. Probably started in November for last month, and then they had a follow-up on it because it was such a hot topic. And the questions kind of rips off of what we were talking about in the last segment, where what are the impact of the two generations being on different platforms and the change in what intimacy is considered. And the question is, bottom line, is that young people are having less sex. And it's come up in a point where, they start asking questions. Well, why is that? What is giving rise to this decline in the sex? And again, the Atlantic teamed up with Teen Vogue to get some stats and some numbers, trying to see, it is also the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's for Youth Risk Behavior Survey. All of them are talking about high school sexual activity as well as college sexual activity, and it's declined over a 10-year period, over a 10-year comparison. So, for example, from 2018 to 2008, the amount of people that were having sex has decreased from what it was from the previous 10 years. So that might have been 2007 to 1997. So bottom line, what they came out with is that, yes, there's less sex being had, and what they pointed to was several different things. They talked about the apps. They talked about the access to porn being one of those things that contributes to decline in sex. And then, like we were talking about last, is that maybe there's a totally different thing in terms of what the definition of intimacy is. And then also looking at hookups not being taboo, historically when we talk about something that's taboo, whether it be rock and roll, whether it be drugs, or whatever, even hip hop for those people of non-color, that's what people flock. And so when you don't have the taboo label over it, people tend to flock to it less. So that's what they were looking at. They were comparing it to baby boomers, Gen Xers, and millennials, and they're saying this youngest generation is having less sex. So, I mean, I'm curious to know from the group, what do you think, you guys? Is there some merit to that, or you think they were just trying to get people to click on the link?
I think there's some merit to it because there's I think when you interact with people from the millennial culture, you find it interesting because you have a lot more of the going back to the study about the maturity where they aspire to be a certain level of mature, but they also view sex in such a way that they end up falling on two completely ends of the spectrum. So it's almost as if there's no gray area. There's either a complete distance from it, or they're grabbing hold to it by the horns head on, with no disregard, with no regard for human life, as Marv Albert would once say. But there's so I think I think that's what it, but that's what it is. You just end up seeing them on two different ends of the spectrum.
We know Marv ain't going without no sex.
Not
My bad.
at all.
Go ahead.
Not at all. But that's kind of what you see is you end up seeing them either heavily on one end of the spectrum or the other, and it's like they don't really find the middle ground, and they can't, because again they grew up in an era where what the generation before them, how they learned to meet people, they didn't learn to meet people that way. So they either end up with, and South Park did a good piece on this the other day where they just talked about people with anxiety. And because of the digital age, it has caused, and I've actually read a couple of studies on this, none I will quote right this second because I'm not looking at them. But what we've seen is a lot of people develop high anxiety from the digital age because they get stuck in their phones and they really want more one-on-one time with themselves than they do with other people. Which so when I heard the story, it didn't shock me, not even the least bit, because just in evaluating the millennials, especially the ones that I've worked with and talked to and just been observing, like they are all on very different ends of the spectrum. They're either very conservative or very, very liberal. There isn't really an in between.
I got some
Well,
numbers I'm gonna pull out real fast to kind of add some fodder to the conversation. It says this is from the Atlantic. It says Gen Xers and baby boomers may also be having less sex today than previous generations did at the same age. From the late 90s to 2014, the data says this is from the General Social Survey. The average adult, check this out now. The average adult went from having sex 62 times a year to 44 times. A given person might not notice this decrease, but nationally, it adds up to a lot of missing sex. They took another study, that's the General Social Survey from 2016, and said it has fallen even faster within a 2-year period.
well, I want to say this,
I can
and
believe
I'll
that
say
one
there's
too.
validity too. Um, just because, let's look at it, and I'm gonna go back just since I'm Gen X, and y'all can attest to this. If when coming up, wasn't a lot of options. It was, especially when you talk about getting into young adulthood. It was kind of the thing to do to like try to get it and get what you can get and Madden football on whatever video game system you had. Other than that, it wasn't a lot of like aspirations but that. So I can see why it's falling, because now you have all these sophisticated gaming systems. You can game on your phone. You have apps. You have TV on demand. It's like you have so many things at hand now. It's just like you don't have to focus on that 2 or 3 things like it was. I mean, when we were coming up, wasn't a lot of cell phones. You had to pay for long distance, so it wasn't but so much. So it's like the big thing was like, hey man, how many numbers you get? Man, I got 6. All right, you gonna try to do something with all 6 of those numbers. I'm just being real, but
It it
I
was
think that's the difference. But now as the generations combine, we have more access to stuff, and it's like, so I could see that. Go ahead, D.
yeah. It was more of an adventure. The adventure now is different because there
Yeah,
there used to be the and I want to preface this by saying I'm not the old get off my lawn man with hair growing out his ears. I'm not
Which
that
means
guy.
if you
But
have to say that, it means you are.
no, I just
I
know I
agree.
look
I agree.
I just know that what I'm about to say is about to sound like it, but I'm far from that guy. But what it is there was a certain level of adventure to having to go to the mall to buy your clothes, having to go to the mall to meet your women, or just going to school events to meet
Yeah,
girls and do things of that nature. That became the adventure. The adventure is still the same, but the adventure now is different. So now instead of having to go out, you will now you can just go online. Now there is the same butterflies you get in your stomach for going out to buy your stuff. People get that by having it come to your house. Like there's a certain level of adulation that people get by waiting for the Amazon box. There's a certain level of adulation people get by being able to swipe left and meeting that person online and getting to meet what you saw in person for the first time. There's a certain level of fix that comes with that, and that's the reason why that we see it. So I don't think it's different, but I still think fundamentally it's the same. It just looks different. But I think the end result becomes fundamentally different. But I think the process is fundamentally the same, just a different avenue.
I think to your point, I agree with you. I think, but there's some things that, and I think this is where we might get, because I'll go ahead. I see myself transitioning to that old man, get off my lawn, and I want to drink my coffee this way. I see myself. I ain't there yet either. But what I think happens is there is something about an appreciation. Going back to my original analogy, I always use, as I'm talking to young people, I always use the analogy of microwave generation. There's something to be said when you have the patience to be able to have to wait for the most primitive type of sustenance. So when your mama, my mama had to come feed us, we still had to wait for that bottle to get done.
Right.
Versus that next generation who didn't have to wait as long as we did. I take that. So that's patience. That's what comes out of there as a personality trait. Another example. Remember in school, if I say Dewey Decimal System and card catalog, you know what I'm talking about. But if I go to a high school right now and mention that to somebody else, they think I'm talking foreign French. Part of that is patience about the process of you have to go and find this number and be self-sufficient versus being fed. Now, one can talk about what's good and what's bad all day long, because one person might say, well, that's just a waste of time. You just wasted umpteen hours out of your life trying to go look for a book where now somebody can tell me exactly where the book is and I can start on to the next thing, right?
Right.
But I think the things that are lost or that are appreciated is that we have a patience. How fearful, like we may run our phones down, which we do, right? But the level of panic that that the three of us might have versus a young person who don't know how to read that interstate sign and don't know which interstates go east and west and that belt lines have 3 numbers. Like if they don't have that because they're used to their Google Maps or Waze telling them which way to go, is what's lost in that. But at the same time, can we manipulate the same technology they have just as fast as they can? You know what I mean? So that's where it comes into is one greater than the other? Probably not. It's probably just a different way to do it,
And I think sometimes the conversation gets lost because we have to realize we're in our 40s now, so a lot of the millennials that we're calling millennials isn't really millennials. That's the Z generation that we're talking about, because that generation is becoming young adults, and those are the ones that are the more PC, but they are the children of us. Like they're spawning from Generation X, and what happens in that particular generation is because Generation X parents are super protective, and because they're so overly protective, they've created a PC format, but they've also created an environment where interaction with other people is lessened because of the overprotection from the Generation X parents. So I think that has a lot of it to do with it as well.
That overprotection, I like that you use that word, because I also think, and in the same way that if Brother McKee were on, he probably would talk about how our parents fought for us so we wouldn't have to struggle the same way they did.
Right.
And the byproduct of that is that we wind up being a softer generation.
Right.
I think we do the same thing as being a protective generation.
Right.
We know our young people are less self-sufficient and independent as we are, right? They depend on that phone, depend on that life. And I think that, in a sense, whether we want to admit it or not, it can be debilitating to them, and we know it ahead of time. So we now are so protective of them that that sometimes we may fall short of being able to allow them to be stronger than what they could, but which is why we put them in the Uber anyway.
Exactly.
Well, on that note, we're going to go ahead, and I'm glad you said Uber, because when we come back, we're going to jump into a little